Today's interview is with Jim Eichner. Jim is the editor-in-chief of Research Technology Management and partner in Outside Insight Consulting. He previously held senior management positions in innovation leadership at Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, Pitney Bowes, and Bell Atlantic. Jim holds BS and MS degrees in mechanical and aerospace engineering from Cornell and Princeton universities, respectively, and an MBA from Southern Methodist University. He is the author of the forthcoming book, Lean Startup in Large Organizations. Jim, welcome to Trusted Peer Entrepreneurship.
Thank you. Thank you. Very glad to be here.
In your book, you state that lean startup has not been as successful in large companies as it has in startups. Why then should large companies consider lean startup?
I think the first thing is it works. So for this particular task of creating a new business from scratch and navigating through all the uncertainty, it works. It works better than anything else I know. The challenge is that each of the practices tends to induce certain antibodies inside the corporate environment. And if you don't care for that, then the process will not work inside the corporate environment. And so you need to not have different practices, but complementary practices in order to make lean startup work in large organizations. And that's kind of, those practices are the focus of my book.
Your premise is that breakthrough innovation is a yes and proposition. What do you mean by that?
So I mean that you need the basic principles of lean startup, and they're the foundational principles, and then you need complementary principles, and they help do what I would call the impedance match between the business you're trying to build and the business you're already a part of. So for example, one of the core principles of lean startup is the lean learning loop. And the idea that at the end of a lean learning loop, you make a decision about whether to pivot or persist. So a lean learning loop is essentially an experiment. It's an experiment to learn something about the market, something about the customer, something about the business model. You do experiments, and the whole lean startup process is one of experimenting, learning, and iterating toward a business. If you do that inside a corporate context, it can seem a little chaotic. You know, you're going wherever the customer wants to go. You don't have a plan that you're executing. You have a learning agenda that you're executing, and you pivot. Well, that can seem somewhat chaotic. How do you manage the chaos inside a large company? What I propose in the book is you introduce something called an innovation stage gate. In it, you're going through the process of first understanding the customer need and the customer value proposition. Then, after you've validated that, understanding what business model options there are and taking the risks out of the business model, and then going through a growth phase where you're usually in incubation. Well, that's different a little bit from the lean startup. It's the same set of principles, but rather than doing everything all at once, you're staging it so that you learn as you go, and and yet within the corporate environment, there's the chance for people to review milestones and see that it's a managed process overall. So it's lean startup would not have gates. It almost seems antithetical to gates to do the lean startup. You're trying to get to market fast, get feedback fast, learn, start with a small customer set and grow from there. Inside a large company, I think you're trying to do the same sorts of things, but you're containing each phase or containing the chaos in each phase. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, it does, actually. Yeah. Both startups and new ventures inside companies face market risks.
Right.
However, a venture inside a corporation deals with internal risks that startups do not face. What are those risks, and how can lean startup mitigate these risks within a large corporation?
So I think about the challenge in both cases is developing a business that works, right? So
Mhm.
you're starting from nothing or almost nothing, and you're slowly understanding the customer, the business model, the channel, operations costs, all that. You're taking the uncertainty out of the business using these experimental or learning-based lean startup principles. Inside a corporation, you're dealing with a few other things. You're dealing with the challenge to people's careers of working with you. So if I'm trying to do a new venture and I need legal help, well, I've got legal help. That's something a startup might not have, but my legal help has other priorities and other other concerns or risks. Corporate liability in a startup, they're not dealing with it. Inside a large company, you are. The sales force has a sales job. You've got to coordinate with them so you don't confuse customers. All of those things are happening, and the people you're working with all have careers and things they've got to get done. So there's that set of risks. I would call those the risks of working with the performance engine. That's the term Govindarajan uses. Then once you get something ready to scale, you open a whole other set of risks. Like, what does this mean for us as a business? I've been happy with it as long as it was experimental. When you want to scale it, where's the money going to come from? How does it affect what I'm going to manage? Are you going to reorganize pieces? What does that mean for me from a career perspective? So there are identity and cannibalization and resource allocation issues that happen at that stage. Those are all things that happen inside a large company, and a startup just doesn't have to deal with them.
Lean startup is a system. Each of the elements are attractive as a standalone practice. But the value for new business innovation comes from adopting lean startup in its entirety. For large organizations, is implementing lean startup an all or nothing decision?
Yeah, I think that the principles are a system. Having said that, there are adaptations that you need to make for your environment. And I've talked about one of them, and there are others that we can talk about. But I think if you do lean learning loops, which is a core principle, business experiments, if you want to call it that, and you do it without a minimum viable product or some sort, I don't know what you learn. If you do a minimum viable product, or what people often call that, but you don't embed it in a process of learning from customers and from the market, I don't know what the point of having a minimum viable product will be. If you do either of these things and you don't have what Reese calls innovation accounting, you're not keeping track of your learning, I don't know where you're going with that. You'll get lost and you'll soon abandon the process. I think the prototype is an example of something that, or the minimum viable product, what Reese calls the MVP, is something that I think gets copied in part unsuccessfully by large corporations. They take the term and say it's more of not a minimum viable product in the way Reese meant it, which is something that meets the minimal needs of a customer set that's worth going after, and does it in a way that helps them solve a real problem. They view it as just another prototype in the cycle. And I don't think that works. So that I think the system works together very well. When I say you have to adapt it, I worked in a tire company. We didn't just roll out prototype tires. They have to go through a testing process before you can do it. But there are things you can learn with other types of prototypes that carry you forward at the same time. So you adapt, but the principles as a whole, I think, are important.
Who is the audience for lean startup in large organizations? Who are you targeting within a large corporation? And, what is large?
Yeah, right. So I think I'll tackle the last question first. Large is, I think, a better word might be established. If your business model is set and established, if everybody's roles are clearly defined, then you're large. You have a way of operating that resists sometimes new businesses, however you're pursuing them. In general, there are kind of two audiences for lean startup and large organizations. One of them is the people who are doing innovation inside large companies right now, at the director level up to the chief technology or chief innovation officer level. And I'm trying to help those people be more effective in implementing lean startup, but more importantly, in doing the broad work associated with new business innovation. So I think that that's the primary audience. And my hope is that it helps people do that more quickly, more surely, and get to market. The second audience is, I think, people who are teaching entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship, as it used to be called. Many students in these programs eventually are going to work in large companies. They may have a stint in startup, the startup may be acquired, startup may go under, they may decide they'd rather work where they've got the resources that a large company brings. So many will do that. And I think it's good for them to understand that it's a different world and these are the ways it's different and what you can do about it. And then the second is many startups spend a lot of their time partnering with large companies, either because the companies have some asset that they need or a channel to customers. There's a synergy, and understanding how large companies work and how they're making decisions and where their risk profiles are, I think can help even people who end up in startups.
Where does how important is it to have buy-in from the CEO on this?
I think it's important to have buy-in from the CEO in a couple of ways. First of all, the CEO is generally not going to muck around in the practices you use.
Of course.
But it's important to know two things from the CEO. One is, where do you want to play? What is the opportunity space that's interesting and large enough and valuable enough to you? So they want to go there. He also needs to provide some sort of legitimacy or air cover for the teams to operate, because they're going to be working, whereas R&D often worked in the labs, these innovation teams are out with your customers, they're working with your internal procurement, with your internal sales, with your IT organization, and they're going to need some permissions to operate maybe a little bit outside of normal standard operating procedures. And then finally, at the end, the CEO's got to be involved in making the decision about, do we scale this or not? And has to be involved with also getting his or her senior team engaged around the innovation agenda. So it requires some funding. That happens in a lot of places. It requires some time to really understand these new markets and where they're going and why they're important. Oftentimes there's short shrift on the amount of time that's spent by CEOs on the innovation agenda. And then it requires some influencing of the peer group of his own peer group or her own peer group in order to make the big bets when those are warranted.
The National Science Foundation in the United States, they have embraced and they have been supporting I-Corps programs. These are lean startup based programs at over 100 universities. They've been doing it for years. How is lean startup for large corporations different from the NSF I-Corps program for research scientists?
So first of all, the stuff we do is built on top of what they've learned. So, the lean startup was formulated by Steve Blank and Eric Ries and later Osterwalder. You may have talked to all three of them. I don't know by now. But everything we do inside the corporate settings is built on, in some way, the work that they did. The work that Blank in particular did with NSF just provided a lot of scale. So we could learn what works and what doesn't work and how to keep track of a lot of things and how to do reviews and so forth. So I think it's very important. Those people are starting often with a technology that doesn't have a market or with a concept that they're trying to discover the market from. So a lot of the work in the I-Corps that I'm familiar with is really about getting out into the world, which is a reluctance for a lot of scientists or engineers to do, getting the feedback, understanding the concept that you want to understand, not solve the world's problems, but solve the problem of a niche part of the market first in order to build a successful business. So we build on that. I think that the big differences, other than working with that performance engine, are inside when you're building a new business model, which you often need to do for a business that's outside the core. You have to care for things that you don't when you're in a startup. So you have to care for how might this cannibalize the core business? When we want to scale it, should we just scale it organically? Should we combine it with other assets of the corporation and create a new division? Should we acquire something and build the business based on that? There's so many options open to a large corporation, not often necessarily exercised, but open, and they're different. And you have to, when I did new business innovation at Goodyear, I kept track not only of the P&L of the business itself, but also the shadow P&L of its impact on the core. Was it cannibalizing it? Was it driving new sales? To the extent that we could do that, we were trying to do that because it's a natural concern. So I think the I-Corps stuff was great. I love the work that they've done. I love what they've learned about it. Generally, it's the first 10 weeks of maybe a 9-month or 10-month process, but it's a vital 10 weeks, and it sets the stage so teams that do it are in the rhythm and cycle for doing this well, I think.
So could the 10-week lean startup based I-Corps program, could that be more seamlessly bolted into the front end of the development process for large corporations?
You could. So you could imagine in the process we used at Goodyear, we had a discovery phase that ended in the customer value proposition. We had a business model development phase, and we had an incubation phase, basically. And the first part is very similar to what people do with I-Corps. One key difference is, and I think this is a very important one for corporations, you want to start with a clear opportunity space rather than with an idea. So you're not starting with a concept or even a technology. You're starting saying, we want to grow in the services realm in the tire business, or we want to grow in document management in healthcare, which was one of the areas at Pitney Bowes. Why is that? It's aligned with the strategic objectives of the corporation, first of all, and then second of all, it may enable you to use assets that aren't available to new startup competitors. And if you don't have assets that you're leveraging as a new venture inside a corporation, you're probably disadvantaged. VCs may pour more money into you than a corporation will. You can move with more agility because you're not coordinating all the internal dynamics. So I think I-Corps is great. I think I like the practices of design, which are really at the core of what the NSF does. I love the idea, and Steve Blank says it all the time: get the hell out of the business, out of the building, and into the world. And I love the idea of prototyping as a language for doing the learning. So I'm all in with it, but it still needs to be, I think, built on for large companies.
For large companies that may hesitate to dive into the deep end for implementing lean startup, do you recommend a professional development workshop for senior managers on lean startup as a way of socializing the concept before a tactical implementation of lean startup projects? That is, should you teach lean before implementing lean?
So I think it's a good question, and so I have sort of mixed thoughts about it. Generally, at the senior executive level, they're more interested in where you're going, what your results are going to be. They want to know that you have a process that will work. So I don't know whether they need an intensive seminar on lean startup, although maybe giving them a copy of a book on it would help, whether it's the basic books from Blank and from Reese, or augmented by what I've just written. But I think they're not in the nuts and bolts, other than to understand that it's actually working. Now, they do also have a role in making sure that if we're doing this in our corporation, other people are cooperating with it. Now, I will say GE took a different approach. GE said, we're going to treat this like Six Sigma. Everybody's going to get involved with it. We have a training institute. The division managers will adapt it to their needs, but we're going to use it as a general tool. I would say the best way to get people educated is to get a few teams going in an area of importance to you, and make sure the teams are well educated and have the skill sets necessary and the access to resources. That will start to educate people when they start understanding what results are given. And then whoever's reviewing them obviously needs to review from a learning agenda perspective, not from a traditional, well, what are your sales, what's your profitability? You don't want to look at it through those lenses until you're much further along.
The Trusted Peer Entrepreneurship community consists of university entrepreneurship center directors, educators, program managers, et cetera. Earlier in your career, Jim, you co-founded the MIT Innovation Laboratory. What are the factors that a university should consider in setting up a similar innovation laboratory?
Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about that, because I love the work that I've been involved with there. So that was founded by Eric von Hippel, who's a professor at MIT Sloan School of Management, and he's kind of the father of lead users and community-based innovation organizations. He had the idea at one point, and he approached three of us to work with him on it, that maybe we should test these ideas in the real world. So we started with, I was at then 9X, the telephone company. There was someone from the telecom division of 3M and from Nortel. And we were working, and we were saying, okay, now let's understand what these principles are, and let's try it. Let's try to do lead user studies to try to find lead users. Let's try, another of his ideas was task partitioning. Let's separate between partners who does what. Another is related to communities, and that's exploded since it was first talked about there with open source and community innovators. But the idea was get practitioners together with the people who are doing the studies and the theory, and see if it works in the real world, and then have that feed back into the research. I think that model, I think we met 3 times a year. It was a parallel track. It was sort of, let's learn stuff, and then let's share what we learned by trying stuff. I think that model is a great model. I also have worked with Aston University in the UK in a similar way around advanced services. Again, a cohort of 8 companies that are trying to do this, and they're learning from the research and they're sharing their practice. And it's a very constructive two-way process.
Would you advise university entrepreneurship programs to include the study of corporate intrapreneurship in their curricula?
Yes, I would. And the reason is that, at least at this stage, not everybody's going to go work for a startup. And and innovation is becoming so much a part of of many functions. So now you'll find heads of innovation in R&D, of course, in marketing, in IT, in independent innovation divisions. People are going to get to progress in consumer packaged goods, for example, as a firm. You've got to show that you can innovate, not just that you can manage an ongoing brand. So I think people need to learn what it means to do that inside a company, not just what it means to do de novo, because they're very, very different animals.
You cite Alexander Osterwalder's business model canvas as an innovation accounting tool. In a large corporation, who trains the innovation teams on how to use the BMC and how to review the results?
So that's probably, Alex uses it differently than I do. And I find it most useful in sort of keeping track of where we are. So combining it with a Kanban board of what's yet to be done and what's been learned. But I found when I've worked with executives that it helps them sort of understand what they've done and, more importantly, what they haven't done. So oftentimes even people who are leading an incubator are not necessarily considering all the factors necessary to make a business work. And if you can show a canvas and parts of it are green and parts of it are yellow and parts of it are red, then they understand, okay, we need to put a little more attention over here. So I've used it together with a Kanban with all the experiments and what is known to date to keep track of where we are and then to represent that in one place so people can see where it goes. I think Alex has continued to evolve the canvas so that he's complemented it with a customer value proposition canvas, which I think strengthens the whole idea. And he's starting to include also some of the quantitative aspects that, in my view, are kind of critical to driving the agenda. You need to know you can't brainstorm the elements of a business. You need to have a coherent business that you can model. And so those financials, I think, are equally important. I find it very useful to think in terms of business model archetypes. So there are not, and I think Alex and I disagree on this, but I don't think there is an infinite number of business models that are viable. I think that people try a whole bunch, and then over time, certain ones work, get adapted, and become the dominant business models. And I think even today, after all the change we've seen in the last decade, I think there are maybe 40 or 45. Mm-hmm. And those, if you start with a good understanding of those, then you can adapt them to your situation. But I think the canvas it's very accessible to people. People understand it. Executives understand it, not just innovation teams. It opens people's eyes as to what we have to get done. And so I think it's a valuable tool. I like to augment it with some others.
So what you're saying then is that right out of the box, anybody should be able to understand how the business model canvas works as a tool.
I think as a tracking tool, they should. I think when Alex uses it as part of a process for doing strategy and business model development, they probably do need someone to help facilitate them through that process.
Okay. You state that the innovation team should meet regularly to review the status of the various experiments, make decisions to pivot or persist, and prioritize the next set of experiments. Who is on a typical lean startup team, and how are they identified to become team members?
So a team, I think, is usually 2 or 3 people. When it gets up to incubation, it's a bigger team, obviously, but when you're at the stage of trying to discover the customer value proposition and you're trying to shape the business model, I think a team of 2 or 3 people is good. I have found that, at the very front end, people who have a design background are good to have because they understand customers. People who can make stuff, even if it's crude stuff, are very important to have at that stage. Sometimes the people with the design and that generative capability are different from the people who do the business experiments. So I've had them in where I've done this in my career, I've had them separated. So there was one team that developed the value proposition. Sometimes a team member went with it into the business model development, sometimes not. And then the people who develop the business model are taking the value proposition and the customer value creation, and they're looking at opportunities and they're doing the experiments. When in either case, you're going through this cadence of learning from the world, whether it's from customers or from in the business model. What I find, if you don't set up a cadence of reviews, it gets slow, and a lack of speed kills it because this feeds on new information. So people used to complain when I would want to have reviews more frequently. So we did it every 2 weeks, and then eventually it was done more internally, and I was involved on a monthly basis. But what does it do? It just forces you to say, what did we do? What did we learn? And if you look at yourself in the mirror and say, we didn't do anything and we didn't learn anything, or we didn't do anything meaningful, then that's the spur to move further. If what you learned was this isn't going to work, then it's a good time to have a review and understand where we are and how we should pivot and what does it mean. So I think it's mainly to keep the energy in the system and to make sure people, a tendency is for people to spend a long time planning an experiment when they should spend a short time, to make it more complicated than it needs to be. So challenging those kinds of things can help, I think.
Where do the teams operate within a corporation? I mean, is it this all in development, or, you know, where do you see them operating?
I think they happen in different places in different companies. So sometimes people set up a whole sort of separate little place that's the incubator. Sometimes it reports to a chief innovation officer at a high level. Sometimes it's part of R&D as part of their innovation mission. And then it's in the organization, but it has its own budget. I think it doesn't, sometimes it would be part of a growth strategy agenda. I think where you put it is less important than just making sure that it's staffed. You know, you have people, and that the adherence to a learning agenda and to review against the learning agenda is there. Something that I found extremely useful, it was, I first had the opportunity to use it at Goodyear, was sequestering funds, putting them in a little bucket off to the side for when you got to incubation. So we had a fund that the CEO had approved, but it could not be used for anything except taking a new business to market. And that required the CEO's approval. But it didn't require that he find the money somewhere and take it out of somebody else's budget or cause you to cut something else. It just made it available. So, you know, there are practices where it's organized is less important than that you have staff, you have some dedicated staff. There are, you know, the leadership reviews it from a learning perspective, and that there's funds so you don't hit a wall when you get to incubation.
So this is a chicken and egg question. Which comes first? Creating a culture of innovation that drives new businesses, or getting a few marketable successes out of the lean startup process as a demonstration of success?
Yes, I mean, I think it is a chicken and egg question, and the answer is you need to look at both culture and your practices at the same time. So when you're implementing lean startup, you need to be asking, how will this fit in my organization? If I'm going to use this for new business, will it fit as part of a division or as part of the core, or does it have to be somehow separated? What sorts of values need to be in place culturally for this to succeed? So you need to be creating the culture that will support lean startup at the same time that you're doing lean startup, because the only way cultures develop is people do things, they work, and they do them again. So I think at first you start out, you say, I want to do this, and you ask, are there any things that I can identify right now that are going to stop it from working? If there are, let's design for those right now. Let's figure out what they are and figure out culturally how we can intervene in the system to make sure that they don't get in the way. And then you do, and you learn. I think it was Edgar Schein who said, you don't understand a system until you try to change it. Well, you go in, you'll get a reaction. When you get a reaction, ask yourself, what does this mean about the culture? How can I shift it over time? And you grapple with that issue. You don't expect anything I don't expect any practice is going to work out of the box. It's going to require iteration inside the organization in order to get the fit with the culture that's there and to shape the culture that's there.
As a consultant for large corporations in the area of lean startup, what do your consulting engagements, what do they entail? What do they cover? What do they look like?
Yeah, so it varies, of course, depending on what someone's trying to do. So with respect to lean startup, that's mostly used when people want to actually generate new businesses. So when I engage there, I try to help people understand, what lean startup is. I also try to understand what will work inside their corporate context and to make adaptations for that. And then I generally work with people just by coaching them through the process. And it's the same kinds of things I would do when I was inside a corporation. Say, are you getting out there to the customers? What are your experiments? What do they look like? Could you make it simpler? Can we move faster? How are you keeping track of your learning? What are you doing inside the organization to make sure you have alignment? Are you understanding customer value? Are you looking at business model alternatives? So it's really just a matter of asking a lot of questions that help people to stay on track and keep the pace moving.
Do you help the corporation decide which projects to run through the lean startup process?
You could. I mean, I think it. I think the main, like I said, the main benefit I think is when you're really trying to start a business from scratch. You can benefit from business experiments in almost any situation, and they are the lean learning loops. But where the biggest value I think comes is when you're starting a new business and you may need to create a new business model to go with it. If you're doing, Procter & Gamble, for example, did a lot of wonderful innovation using open innovation, where they found ideas, they used their labs to get them into an optimized form. They used their marketing engine and their channel to drive them to market and so forth. Where you're using your existing business to drive things forward, I think you get a little less value out of the full lean startup process. You get a lot out of the design up front. It's when you're starting to say, look, I have either my business is being commoditized, and I guess who isn't being commoditized, but my business is being commoditized, or I want another leg to the stool. And you're trying to create a whole new revenue stream and perhaps a new business model that I think it's most important. And sometimes a lot of companies have a lot of these ideas that are sitting in the technology center, unformed ideas. They don't have a lot of customer insight. You have to do what I call go left. You have the idea. Now, if this is the idea, then what else might meet this same need? What are the needs it's meeting, and what else might do it? Try to go back to the customer need and consider alternatives rather than just push through an idea you already had. So you'd have to do it on a one-by-one basis. I guess that's what I'm saying. You look at the things, you ask where they are, you ask where they want to go, what the purpose is, what you know, what you don't know. Most often, people are starting with things that are great ideas without having done a lot of the insight work up front.
You mentioned open innovation. The concept of open innovation was supposed to be the new solution to future proofing. What is open innovation, and is it still relevant today?
I think open innovation is very relevant. I mean, I think essentially it's opening up the sources of innovation outside the boundaries of your four walls, and it's looking for people who might bring solutions to you and solve your problems that you might never have even considered were thinking about problems like yours. And so I think it's something we have to get better at. I think the fact is right now, it's a little bit hard inside corporations for two reasons. And some people have gotten past these and it works great. But one problem inside corporations is an identity issue. Researchers often own their problems. They are the problem solver. They're not the problem creator and then someone else is the solver. And so if you don't help them understand the new role they'll be playing and why it's a valuable role, and it is, because framing a problem is the most difficult part of doing that problem, then you won't be successful. Second of all, that means to me that it needs to be collaborative. One of the things I learned from Eric von Hippel is there's sticky information. There's information you can't put into a problem-solving brief and you can't articulate. You have to collaborate to get it done. And I think you need to create a team that works together, not outsource the innovation to another party. And then you have to make sure your rewards reward the people who do the problem framing, not just the external person who solved the problem. But I think it's very relevant. I think that Henry Chesbrough, when he pioneered the open innovation movement, he said there are two flows, one of ideas outside in and the other ideas inside out. So if it's inappropriate to your business, we'll spin it out, get some value from it. I disagree with him about that. I think if you use Lean Startup, you can take those ideas and you can make unless they're very far away, you can make them succeed inside your corporation. So, but I think it's a very valid and useful concept. I think it does, it hasn't been as successful in all companies as it was in some of the pioneering companies.
Are you seeing that large corporations confuse incremental innovation of existing products and services with disruptive innovation and Horizon 3 opportunities?
Yeah, I think yes, at some level. I think disruptive innovation is not well understood by a lot of people. It's as Clay Christensen mapped it. It comes into play when the old dimensions of value or merit to the customers are overmet or are supplanted by new dimensions of merit that matter more. And if you miss that boat, if you keep trying to make yourself better along the current dimensions of merit, and you invest all your money in that, what you might call incremental innovation, then you may win a lot of contests and awards, but you'll miss the getting hit upside the head by a disruptor who has something different. So again, I'll take, in my industry, in my career, several times disruption has happened. And, sometimes it was better prepared for than others. In the telco industry, the landline business was completely disrupted by cellular and also by online communications like we have. They bring different things, lower cost, but also different benefits, an entirely different set of benefits. When I worked at Pitney Bowes, we were mainly in the mailing business and single piece mail. Well, email disrupted many segments, one after the other, of that business. If you're focused on being the best at whatever you are and getting incrementally better every year, then you may miss that new dimension of value. And I think that's what people have to be looking for. And one of the consequences is, if you find it, first, people have to agree that it's different and new and valuable. And second of all, you may need a different business model. The business model for photography today is completely different from the business model of a film company. That's why it was so hard for Kodak to pursue it. So I think people become obsessed with the incremental and downplay the disruptive rather than confusing them. I just think they overinvest in incremental.
Got it. In your interview with Alexander Osterwalder, he stated, "We need to train chief financial officers that spending $100,000 to shut down an idea may save millions of dollars. We have to look at the financials through the lens of a portfolio and not individual ideas. The metrics for early stage venture capital indicate that you need to invest in 250 projects to produce one that has a financial return that is higher than 50x. You just can't pick the big winners. You need to invest in a portfolio of projects. Steve Blank has said that most companies don't understand that if they want to build internally, they need the equivalent of a funnel, just like VCs. How can you convince resource-constrained corporations to support a portfolio of lean startup projects?"
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think, first of all, they're both very right. And when I was doing this work for Goodyear, we did have a portfolio. So we had a few platforms. So one was services advanced services. And there were a few other platforms, and we had multiple projects in each portfolio. And so many of them failed at the first stage, the discovery phase. Some of them failed at the business model development phase. And then some went into incubation and they never got scaled. So one thing is, I just think you have to do it. If you're a corporation, the scale of some of these companies we're talking about, you can afford it, and you probably can't afford not to do it. But coming with that, the willingness to invest needs to be some rigor about starting and stopping projects, some understanding that learning making the decision to stop something isn't failure, it's learning, and you move to the next project in the portfolio. Excuse me, I think a lot of people do not think that way. Our CFO at Goodyear understood that ours was 10-3-1. We said we're gonna, how many ideas we look at to get to one that we bring to incubation. But we said we'd take 10 that we would put into incubation, 3 that we would scale, and 1 that we thought would pay. And before that 10, there were probably 40 or 50 that you try. So there's a funnel there, and there's an acceptance that it's a portfolio-based play. The other thing is leverage the work that other people are doing. So create relationships with incubators in Silicon Valley. See what other people are doing. Partner and do experiments with people who are operating in a like space. You still, I think, want to be doing the work internally, because if you understand your customer needs and what will work, and you can find a partner in a startup that's already working in or around what you're doing, you can accelerate things dramatically. So I would say you get the portfolio effect in 2 ways. One, by working with startups, and the second, by running your own smaller and targeted portfolio, targeted on your opportunity spaces.
So how can a large corporation or large company generate and manage a significant enough number of innovative concept projects to deliver the one new business for the enterprise? What I mean by that is, how can you source, you had mentioned 10-3-1, and there were 40 before then. How do you continuously source those 40?
Where do you get the ideas?
Yeah.
So I find that that's the smallest problem, but that's and the reason, and probably people who work for me would say I'm being glib, but picking the opportunity spaces is key. But once you do that, if you go out into the world and discover where people are and where they're having challenges, and you bring your knowledge of where technology can play and what your business assets are, ideas start coming. I've never seen that fail. If you take people, engineers, combined with people skilled at doing customer observation, and you spend 2 weeks at a mine, and you observe what's happening in and around tires in the mine, or spend 3 weeks in a hospital and you understand what they're doing with documents in the hospital, the ideas are going to come at you at a great rate. The question is going to be, which of these ideas deliver the real value? What combination of ideas create a value proposition that really matters? So I know a lot of companies do hackathons, and they try to source ideas, and then they try to filter them and pick the best ideas. I just think that's backwards, because then though you have the ideas and you don't have customer need, and you don't have the tie to the corporate strategy. I would say, why don't we start with the company cares about moving into healthcare and document management in healthcare? Who can we go learn? We'll learn from community hospitals. We'll learn from clinics. Well, let's get a team together and go observe what's going on there. And let's iterate with them about our ideas and see what lands and what doesn't land. If you do that, the ideas, and then you say to the engineers and the technical people, here's a problem people really would like to solve. Well, they'd love that. Okay, I got a problem to solve. Let me solve it. And they will. And it's, I just don't think that's a problem, although I know it's where a lot of places focus. They want to get the ideas. Well, the ideas are a dime a dozen if you have a good need.
It's a great quote.
Yeah.
In your interview with Alexander Osterwalder, he stated that startups used to be what Steve Blank called ankle biters. Today, they're actually better funded than most corporate ventures. The venture capital that startups have access to today is truly amazing, and ventures within established companies are not as well funded as startups in many cases. Should corporations be taking an acquisition approach to innovation to avoid innovation risk?
I think that so my view is the observation is correct. The venture capitalists will bet to win. Once they have an idea that they think is a winner, they're going to go all in, especially in some of these markets where the early players have an advantage. So that's one part of the equation. I think I think acquisition should be part of what you do, but I think it should be part of your business building strategy, not part of your, not simply the whole strategy. And what I mean by that is pick the areas that you want to grow in, do the on the ground research, understand where the needs are, understand where you can add the most value. By all means, be out there looking at what startups are doing. Try to find and partner startups who you can work with to bring the value proposition together. And once you have something that's working, then start asking yourself, how do I build this business? Should I acquire a startup? Should I combine it with some other part of my business in order to get leverage? Should I just invest more than I'm investing organically? What do I do? And how many companies will invest to minimize the potential downside loss rather than to maximize the upside? VCs will do just the opposite. So I think there needs to be the executives in corporations need to get better at making that bet to win decision. A company like Amazon does a great job at making the bet to win decision, but they go through, I don't think they use the term lean startup, but they're very customer focused and understanding the customer problem. They experiment, they develop the business model over time. They incubate it in one part of the business, but then if it works, boom, they invest and it becomes a big business for them. Whereas the same idea invented inside many large companies just would be growing small at a slow rate. So I think it's a very important skill for the next generation CEO. I think Amazon is the kind of company that will emerge and thrive. And their ability to both operate and to innovate is amazing. And I think more companies will just have to learn how to do that.
Jim, when will your book, Lean Startup in Large Organizations, be available? And where can I purchase a copy?
Okay. Yeah, the book is going to be published February 23rd. It's available already for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. I have a small site where I'll be posting a blog that's called leanstartup.biz. So Lean Startup with the .biz end. And so you can go there and you can click through as well. But it's on Amazon and Barnes & Noble now.
I was able to review excerpts of the book, and it's really insightful. Great information in that. Jim, thank you so very much. I've really enjoyed speaking with you today, and I look forward to sharing your interview with the Trusted Peer Entrepreneurship community.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, Philip.